Good day everyone, I am Lovely Colosa and for today's discussion, we are going to talk about another literary movement known as confessional poetry. So the term itself is quite intriguing and controversial, am I right? Because if we are to analyze the term confessional from the words confession and confess, we can generate an idea that it talks about the things that are considered confidential and are subject for confession. So in other words, this movement sounds like it was full of secrets and particularly revelations. So to further elaborate these concepts, let us now discuss the concepts under this movement. Let's begin with the definition of the confessional poetry. So, confessional poetry is a style of poetry that is personal, often making use of a first-person narrator. It is a branch of postmodernism that emerged in the US in between the late 1950s and early 1960s. It is said to be personal because authors usually utilize first-person point of view to write their works. The use of these first-person perspectives make it likely that a great majority of these poems are reflective of the poet's own life. But this is certainly not always the case because they often wrote from the experiences of other people, such as their family, colleagues, and other people around them. Additionally, the term confessional poetry was first used by a critic named M.L. Rosenthal as he reviewed Robert Lowell's first book, Life Studies, in 1959. He described Lowell as a writer who broke through the barriers of the traditional, idealized poetic figure and became an individual one of a kind, and relatable to those who sought out his work. Okay, so having defined confessional poetry, have you ever wondered about the themes and genres used back then? Well, don't worry because that is the next thing we are about to discuss. So, unlike in other movements where the themes or compositions usually deals with common topics such as religion, love, environment, and other relevant matters, confessional poetry frequently deals with taboo topics such as death, sex, addiction, suicide, mental health, and familial relationship. So basically, the confessional poetry of the mid-20th century dealt with subject matter that previously had not been openly discussed in American poetry. Private experiences with and feelings about death, trauma, depression, and relationships were addressed in this type of poetry, often in an autobiographical manner. And again, these were frequently derived from personal experiences of the authors or from the stories of other people around them, which is why it is called confessional. So moving on, let us now proceed with getting to know the four names popular in confessional poetry. Let's start with Robert Lowell. So it was mentioned earlier that Robert Lowell was the author of Life Studies, which was the book reviewed by Rosenthal before he came up with the term confessional to identify such work. So Robert Lowell was an American poet who was a Pulitzer Prize awardee in 1947. He grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and studied at Harvard University and Kenyon College. He is best known for his volume Life Studies in 1959, and he served as a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets from 1962 until his death. However, he suffered from bipolar disorder, which later became the topic of his works. So, among his works, his Life Studies was considered as the first ever book referred to as confessional poetry. He also wrote two poems from his personal experiences. He wrote Walking in the Blue to narrate his experience in mental hospital, presumably in McLean Hospital where he was treated for mental problem. Second, Home After 3 Months Away still deal with issues of mental illness and took place after his release in the mental hospital. Next, we have W.D. Snodgrass, who was a student of Lowell. William DeWitt Snodgrass was an American poet who was born in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania on January 5, 1926. He attended Geneva College and the State University of Iowa, where he earned his MFA in 1953. His early work was compared to the work of his teachers, Robert Lowell and Randall Jarrell. His work entitled Heart's Needle was published in the same year as Lowell's Life Studies published. He published it in 1959 and received the Pulitzer Prize Award in 1960. Since then, he has published numerous books of poetry, including Not for Specialists, New and Selected Poems 2006, The Forer Bunker, The Complete Cycle in 1995, Each in His Season in 1993, The Forer Bunker, A Cycle of Poems in Progress in 1977, which was nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Poetry. So we're down to the third confessional poet, Anne Sexton. So Anne Sexton was born in Gray Harvey in Newton, Massachusetts on November 9, 1928. She attended boarding school at Rogers Hall, Lowell, Massachusetts, where she first started writing poetry. And just like Lowell, she also suffered from mental illness, and her therapist encouraged her to write poetry. So Anne Sexton, like her fellow confessional poets, studied with Robert Lowell. She also suffered from mental illness, which makes her therapist encourage her to write poetry. Her poem, Wanting to Die, from the collection Live or Die, is an intense and heartbreaking look inside a suicidal mind. Her works include To Bedlam and Partway Back in 1960, and All My Pretty Ones in 1962. She won the 1967 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for her third collection, Live or Die, in 1966. In total, she published 9 volumes of poetry during her lifetime. It includes Love Poems in 1969, The Book of Folly in 1973, and The Awful Rowing Toward God in 1975. So moving on with the fourth author, Sylvia Plath is probably the most widely known confessional poet. She was born on October 27, 1932 in Boston, Massachusetts, and she studied in Massachusetts in 1957 with Robert Lowell. So her life experiences were her primary inspiration in writing her works. Her first collection of poems, Colossus, was published in 1960 in England, and her poetry is both tightly controlled and full of rage. So, 2 of her most famous poems, Daddy and Lady Lazarus, are also excellent examples of confessional poetry dealing with the death of her father and suicide attempts, respectively. So, she wrote most of the poems that would comprise her most famous book, Ariel, in the winter of 1962 after her husband, Ted Hughes, left her. So, she also published a semi-autobiographical novel entitled The Bell Jar under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas, and she died on February 11, 1963. So, her other works were published by Hughes after her death. This includes the collected poems, which was the recipient of the 1982 Pulitzer Prize Award. So those were the 4 most widely known confessional poets, but actually there are lots of them. And if you're asking if confessional poetry still exists nowadays, the answer is absolutely yes. So the impact of confessionalism can still be felt today, and it has influenced the vastly popular style of slam or spoken word poetry. And some of the most moving examples of slam poetry come from writers who bear their personal experiences on stage and of course are able to engage with the audience in a meaningful way. Some examples of modern works that applies confessional poetry were There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyoncé by Morgan Parker, Ordinary Beast by Nicole Seeley, and Don't Call Us Dead by Dennis Smith. So you can also visit the internet for more if you are seeking for other examples. So okay, we have discussed the meaning of confessional poetry, the themes used by the confessional poets, the 4 major confessional poets and their works, and of course, some works under confessional poetry in the present. So that concludes our discussion, and I hope you've learned enough. Again, I am Love Me Colosa, and thank you for watching.